Okay, we are live. Hello, and welcome to today's Manhattan Town Hall program with the LaRouche organization. My name is Kynan Thistlethwaite. I'll be your host for today. I think what we'll do now, we'll just start by putting something on your screen. This is Helga's recent statement. This was published on December 8th, shortly after the release of the Trump administration's national security strategy. Now, whatever its flaws, and it certainly has some, that document represented a significant break with the unipolar world order and the anti-Russia policy that's been driven by NATO and until very recently, the Biden administration. And the title of the statement, as you can see, is very direct. Withdraw from NATO. New national security strategy requires new security architecture. And this has been published for immediate circulation internationally. And the point of what I'll be doing in my intro is to get you to endorse the statement and to circulate it as wide as possible. Now, what I've done is I pulled a few passages from the beginning and the end of the document. And I want to say up front, what we're doing today is a little unusual. We're asking you to endorse it, and we know that not everyone is going to read the full statement right away. But we can walk through key sections of it together to give you an idea. And based on what you hear, either during the program or afterward, we want you to add your endorsement. So I'm just going to start right at the beginning of the statement. If I could just pull it up for you. There. So here's how it begins. Although the recently published 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy was received by some leading circles in Europe with a mixture of gnashing of teeth, temper tantrums, and despair, it should be considered, under the circumstances, as having usefully provoked the crisis that was long overdue. Now, I'm going to now jump to the very end of the document because the conclusion really captures what's at stake here. Helga writes, I'm sorry, that is not the right slide, but I will just go to the conclusion myself. We have reached a point in the universal history of mankind where we must leave behind not only half a millennium of colonialism, but also the mindset that led to 2 world wars in the 20th century, geopolitics. We must leave behind once and for all the barbaric idea that we always need an enemy, that man is a wolf to man, as Thomas Hobbes, the ideologist of the British Empire, believed. We are the only species known in the universe that is endowed with creative reason, and we must now use it by putting the idea of one humanity first as we establish a new order. So, what's the issue here? The reassessment, however limited it is by U.S. officials of America's relationship to NATO, has opened the door to something much bigger. The possibility of a completely new international security architecture, one based on the principle of indivisible security for all nations. That idea isn't new. It goes back at least to the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which concluded the 30 Years' War, up to that point the most bloodiest conflict in all of European history. But today's European leadership, people like Friedrich Merz, Keir Starmer, and others in what they call their coalition of the willing, have thrown that tradition of Westphalia right out the window. And they're now openly violating basic principles of international law, as we saw recently with the attempt to seize $300 billion in Russian assets that's been frozen in Belgian banks. For the moment, that attempt at outright financial piracy has completely failed. but the intent is clear. And the larger point is this: as long as the international system remains chained to geopolitics, as if endless conflict were somehow human nature, there can be no lasting solutions for anyone, anywhere. So we'll come back to Helga's statement in just a moment. But first, to situate things, we're going to play Helga Zepp LaRouche's weekly briefing to the International Peace Coalition, which she helped initiate. And just a little background on the grouping, if you don't know about it. This is a growing group of people from many countries and many different backgrounds, who are united around one very important goal, which is preventing thermonuclear war. And I really want to emphasize this. If you're not already listening to the International Peace Coalition meeting every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, you should get involved immediately. So with that, let us hear now from Helga Zepp LaRouche.
Thank you, Anastasia, and hello to all of you. Well, these are tumultuous times, and the famous EU summit, which was supposed to make a decision to grab the Russian assets for, basically continuously financing the war in Ukraine, just took place. And despite the fact that Chancellor Merz declared victory afterwards, it's very far from that because of massive opposition inside the European Union, and also some warning signs from elsewhere. They failed to do that, and instead they agreed to basically lend 90 billion to Ukraine, which is basically going to be paid by the taxpayers from Europe. So the opposition was naturally Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, but also the Austrian parliament voted strongly against that. And the rating agency Fitch warned the Euroclear bank that they would be risking downgrading if they would go ahead with it. So as a result, they could not get the vote together. And basically, this is definitely a sign, that if they go ahead with it anyhow, which Merz claims is still a background option, which I don't think is the case, it could trigger not only massive Russian retaliation, but it would undermine the credibility of the European Union banking system in such a way that it could be the final get-go for a collapse of the system. Now, this was a very typical example for the kind of arm-twisting policies the EU is implementing these days. Von der Leyen just told every EU member that they cannot leave until a decision has been made. So it took altogether 16 hours and in one night until 3 o'clock in the morning before they actually reached a so-called agreement. Berliner Zeitung reports that part of the money is actually needed to pay back 45 billion from G7 credit of last year. So they take a credit to pay a credit to pay a credit. Now that is generally known as a Ponzi scheme and criminally liable, at least for an investigation. So this is definitely no victory for the European Union, but naturally the whole Ukraine situation remains hanging in the air. The Russians are making massive progress on the front lines. Zelensky is clearly betting on the Europeans to continuously prolong the war, despite the fact that all military experts are agreeing that this is virtually an impossibility simply because of lack of manpower. Now, with the famous line that this was an unprovoked war of aggression by Russia, something interesting happened as well, and that is that Amanda Sloat, who was the special advisor to Biden, and she had a position in the National Security Council, thought she was called by two advisors of Zelensky. And in this discussion, she admitted that it was clear to her, to Biden, before the war started, that if Ukraine would have agreed to give up on NATO membership in January 2020, that the war would never happened. And it was also clear that if Ukraine would have accepted the peace deal negotiated in Istanbul in March, April 22, the war could have been ended then. The only problem was it later turned out these people calling her, taping the conversation, were not advisors of Zelensky, but they were the famous Russian pranksters, Woven and Lexus, who had already tricked several other politicians believing they were talking to Zelensky. So I don't know why these people are not getting more smart, but that's the case. But that admission that, this is not Russian propaganda, if you say that, but these are the secret thoughts of President Biden before the war broke out, I think is going to be very interesting, at least for historians down the line, if not for the present politicians. Now, the other major crisis naturally is the still pending US invasion of some sort in Venezuela. Now, 2 days ago, Tucker Carlson had, spread alarmism by saying that, he thought that the State of the Union speech, not State of the Union address, but the national address, which President Trump later would give at 9 p.m. that evening, would be the announcement of a US invasion in Venezuela. Now, the whole world was on the tip of their toes. It turned out that President Trump did not even mention Venezuela, but he only gave a 20-minute speech praising his accomplishments or that of his administration, blasting all problems being the result of the Biden administration. But he did not mention that. However, the alarm is not yet called off. There is massive opposition among the MAGA base against any such invasion, and a lot of international pressure had come down from Lula, from Brazil, from President Scheinbaum, from Mexico. So there was a big combination of warnings that this would open up a disaster, but we don't know if this is not going to happen. A land invasion, full land invasion, is very unlikely because the United States would need very, very much larger numbers of soldiers to do that. But it cannot be excluded that a limited operation still is being planned, including a move against President Maduro. Now, the other major story which I want to highlight this week is actually foreboding potentially some really dangerous development, and it is a dangerous development already, and that is that the European Union sanctioned the Swiss analyst Jacques Beau. Jacques Beau is one of the most respected and objective military and political analysts internationally. He's respected in the United States, in Europe. And what is the accusation? That he was basically retailing the Russian narrative about Ukraine. Now, I saw several programs of Jacques Beau on video, and I can tell you from my best judgment, he is not partial, he's not pro-Russia, he's just an objective analyst who did not want to repeat a narrative of which he knew by the facts that it was not true, namely that the Ukraine would be winning this war and that Russia would suffer a strategic defeat. So he kept, analyzing the facts on the ground, and it is unbelievable. This is now, he was sanctioned. His bank accounts were frozen. He, being a Swiss national, cannot travel inside the EU around anymore. He's residing in Belgium, in Brussels. He's not allowed to leave Belgium. It is a complete scandal, because all this man has done, to my best knowledge, is to try to have an objective analysis about a war which potentially could lead to World War III. And his only crime is that he had an opinion which was different than that of the official narrative. Now, if that continues, and it is not the first case, we had the sanctions by the EU against German journalists living in Russia, Alina Lipp and Thomas Röper. And there are actually a whole number of less famous journalists from, with European passports, but maybe African background or some other background. So there is right now a very clear effort to just forbid any different opinion. And when the investigative journalist Florian Warbeck, who is a member of the Federal Press Club in Berlin, was asking the official German government if they would back up this decision by the EU, they just completely flatly said, yes, we do, and that anybody who is doing similar things should be aware that the same thing could happen to them as well. Now, this is unbelievable. This is an expatriation of a European citizen. It's the muzzling of the freedom of the speech. It goes against the EU Charter. It goes against the UN Charter. It goes against the German Grundgesetz for sure, against the First Amendment in the United States. And it has to be regarded as a very grave development which should be taken up. And, if this is not changed, the next person the EU will sanction is Pope Leo XIV, because he condemned war and he said only peace is holy. And, if they put the Pope on the sanction list, then the whole world will hopefully wake up, or hopefully before. Now, I think we need, therefore, to absolutely continue our efforts to try to unite the international peace movement, because these are all extremely alarming signs. And, given the absolute continuation of the willingness of the armament and rearmament, one can only put the alarm clocks on the highest level. Now, just to end with a slight positive note, we had in my call to use the fact that the head of the military commission of NATO, Admiral Dragone, had called for a preemptive attack on Russia, and the fact that the NATO propaganda unit had put out this absolutely incredible PR video in which they claim that war is forever part of the nature of man, which I absolutely reject as a bestial image of man, which we cannot accept and which is propaganda but not reality. I had used that to call for replacing NATO with a new security and development architecture, which must take into account the interest of every single country on the planet for it to work. Now, in that, obviously, we are still promoting this call. I ask everybody on this call to sign it, to continuously spread it to all your networks, family, colleagues, social media, because we absolutely have to have a different approach to international politics, a new paradigm where we overcome geopolitics, because geopolitics has been twice the cause for a world war in the 20th century. And if we are not stopping this insanity, we may end up with having no humanity at all, because we all will be dead. Now, extremely important was the youth conference we had last Sunday And I'm very happy that we will have some speakers from that participating in that conference speaking today. So the youth is called upon in the whole world to take responsibility, because if the establishments are driving the world towards war, they have no right to take the future away from the young people, and therefore they have to step forward and play a much, much larger role. So that's what I wanted to say in the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Helga. My name is Kynan Thistlethwaite. If you're just joining us, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Town Hall program with the LaRouche organization. You just heard from Helga, founder of the Schiller Institute, initiator of the International Peace Coalition, and the author of the statement we're asking you all to endorse today. Withdraw from NATO, new national security strategy requires new security architecture. You can find that statement on the Schiller Institute website or in the chat. Madeline just put it in the chat. Now, I'm going to go back to that document now, and we'll take a look at a few key sections. I strongly encourage everyone to read the entire statement, but I will give you a sense of its substance by highlighting a couple of crucial passages. For example, Helga in the statement had directly challenged the claim, which is so often made by pundits in the West, that that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked, or that President Putin invaded simply to expand Russian territory. And she writes, the war could have ended in March 2022 with the Istanbul Agreement between Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which was notoriously sabotaged by then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, after almost 4 years of grueling war and the loss of millions of lives, there is no denying what the former Inspector General of the German Armed Forces and former chairman of the NATO Military Committee, Harold Kuyat, has repeatedly emphasized, that Ukraine has never been in a position to turn the strategic situation around, and certainly is not now, when entire sections of the front are collapsing, when frontline troops and forced conscripts are deserting in droves, and when international military experts openly discuss the fact that the war has been lost. In this situation, for the highest-ranking NATO officer, she's referring to Admiral Giuseppe Dragone, to talk about preemptive strikes is highly irresponsible and amounts to a call for collective suicide. She makes a devastating observation a little bit later. And she says, in nearly 4 years of this war of attrition, neither the EU Commission nor European heads of state have made any attempt to end the war through negotiations. And what's important to understand is that the fact that this war was provoked. It was provoked by European leaders. It was provoked by the Biden administration. And this is no longer speculation or revisionism. It's a part of the public record. She reviewed this in the International Peace Coalition meeting, which you just heard. You'll remember how she discussed Amanda Sloat, who was a senior advisor to Biden and a member of the National Security Council. And she admitted in a conversation with whom she believed were Ukrainian advisors to Zelensky that if Ukraine had renounced NATO membership in early 2020, there would have been no war. And she also confirmed that the war could have ended in early 2022 if the Istanbul agreements had been honored. So none of that happened. And the question becomes for us, what is the alternative? We're calling for a withdrawal from NATO. The statement makes that clear. But we're calling for it not into isolation and not into chaos. We know that NATO has outlived any defensive purpose it once claimed to have. So the real question is, what replaces it? And at the same time, we're facing the breakdown of the transatlantic financial system. There's an irreconcilable contradiction between the hyperinflated world of fictitious financial assets. Think of the derivatives market, which is now estimated to be $2 quadrillion in nominal value, and the collapsing physical economy in the US and Europe, the collapse in production, in agriculture, in manufacturing, in infrastructure, and so forth. So Helga goes back to address directly this problem, and she writes, NATO is no longer an Atlantic defensive alliance, but considers itself the military arm of a unipolar world order pursued since the end of the Cold War. But that order has been replaced by the partnership of the Global South, which are no longer willing to submit to the imperial and colonial structures of the collective West, but are building a new economic order with their BRICS and SCO organizations based on sovereignty and mutual and equal development. She makes the crucial point. We must not oppose this new order, which brings 500 years of colonialism to an end and allows the nations of the global majority to overcome poverty and underdevelopment for the first time. We must rather cooperate with these countries and thus open a new chapter in human history. End quote. That is the essential step toward a new security and development architecture. Even the U.S. national security strategy now effectively rules out NATO expansion. Ukraine is not entering NATO, period. And that's why you have the panic emerging from Europe. But what would truly change the world, and I think this starts to get us to an alternative policy, is a fundamental shift in U.S. policy towards Africa, Asia, South America, which would represent a real community of principle among nations. Once upon a time in America, we had such a conception. That outlook shaped what later became known as the Monroe Doctrine, which was originally crafted by John Quincy Adams when he was a part of James Monroe's presidential administration. Whatever people think of how it's been abused since, the original intent has been completely distorted today by figures like Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, who are using it now to justify intervention into what they say is America's backyard in Venezuela. So we'll be talking about what the Monroe Doctrine actually was in this program and what it was meant to be. And to facilitate that, I'd like to bring in our guest for today, Stuart Battle. Stuart is on staff at Executive Intelligence Review. He's responsible for producing the EIR Daily Alert. He's part of a team that works every day to provide serious analysis of what's really going on in the world and what you can do about it. Later in the program, we'll show you a way to subscribe to the EIR Daily Alert and why you should. So, Stuart, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kynan. Thanks for having me on. So yeah, with that introduction, let me see. So I think you went through a lot, and you situated where we are a lot in terms of the real, historical transformation between what NATO represented and where we are not. It's not clear yet where we are going. Trump is certainly, I think, intentionally and otherwise not very clear on where he intends to take things, but the potential exists. And the thing I want to get into in a minute is, like you said, this Monroe Doctrine, which was brought up explicitly in Trump's recent national security strategy document released last month or at the beginning of this month, and why that was a complete abomination in terms of not only Trump's use of it, but also in terms of the historical reference and understanding of it as such. So But before I do that, let me just say a couple things about the situation with, with Venezuela, the Caribbean. As people know, this has been in the headlines for probably 2 months now. Trump is claiming the largest ever military force is in the history of the Western Hemisphere is now deployed outside of Venezuela. Our largest aircraft carrier is there. We're doing drills. We're doing fighter jet overflights, et cetera, et cetera. But then you had this thing several days ago where Trump claimed that Venezuela is sitting on he didn't say foreign land, but he said they stole the land and they stole, the oil, or they stole a bunch of stuff and we're going to seize it back, which certainly caught me off guard, and probably a lot of other people too. But and there was a fantastic presentation yesterday for people to reference on the International Peace Coalition by one of my associates, Dennis Small, who went through some of what this approach has been and also said, well, if Trump actually believes this, then there's about a dozen other countries in the last, in the recent period, last 50 years, who have also nationalized their oil industries, who I suppose should be prepared to be overthrown by Trump also. Now, this, just looking back at some of it to try to get a grasp of it, it was the case that in 2007 there was a court. They called it an international court, but it was a 3-member body based in Washington, D.C., called the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, which did demand that Venezuela pay ExxonMobil $1.6 billion. So it's possible that's where Trump's claim comes from. There was another court, I think, in France, which had a similar, accusation of Venezuela owing money to an oil company after they had nationalized their oil industry. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but just to give you a sense, that's what's being cited. So keep it in mind. Do we invade countries, exert bone-crushing sanctions and other pressure, economic pressure, to stand up for the interests of a singular company that may or may not have, lost profit in a foreign country? And so what I'd like to go through with that said is, what really is the Monroe Doctrine, and what was the United States that imposed the Monroe Doctrine or established the Monroe Doctrine back in the 1820s, and how was that intended as a policy? So, and then we'll come back to some of what's happening today. So, first of all, the Monroe Doctrine was introduced in 1823. While Monroe was the guy who was on, obviously, the namesake of it, it was written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is possibly the most profound thinker who served as president, or at least in the top 3, and had written the famous speech, which if people haven't read in full, you must, especially Americans. It was his Independence Day speech when he was president a few years later, where he says America should be an example of what we believe in, our principles, and not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy whom we disagree with, but become an example, a role model for the world. So essentially, John Quincy Adams was in the middle of a dispute. Spain had just been kicked out of the Central and South America, and the whole region had, of course, been a series of had just been an endless series of disputes between European colonial powers, Britain, France, Spain in particular, others, Portugal. And what the British were doing in the 1820s was they had proposed to the United States, to James Monroe, that we become their allies in now securing South America now that Spain, colonial Spain, has left. This is, mind you, the British Empire that we had recently fought a revolution against, that had colonies around the world. And they were saying, now we're going to work with you to defend nations, but they refused to acknowledge that any former Spanish colonies are now independent nation states. So this is what was pointed out by John Quincy Adams to Monroe. He said, look, it may sound nice, but they're refusing to recognize sovereignty of these nations. So therefore, we should not enter an agreement with them, a partnership. We should instead explicitly say no European colonial powers are allowed in the Western Hemisphere. This is something that Quincy Adams wrote that year about the recently emancipated South American countries. So he said, this now opens to the whole race of man prospects of futurity in which this union will be called in the discharge of its duties to itself and to unnumbered ages of posterity to take a conspicuous and leading role. So in other words, that our new friends in South America should join us. We have now a prospect of futurity, that we will be called upon to play a leading role in the future of mankind, as an ally, not as a subject, but as an ally in shaping the world that the U.S. wanted to see brought into existence. And he said that the foundations of our relationship must be laid in the principles of politics and morals, new and distasteful to the thrones and dominations of the elder world, meaning Europe, meaning the British and others. So that was what John Quincy Adams said. And I'm not going to quote much from the Monroe Doctrine, except to say that it became known explicitly, and I mean very explicitly, including by Monroe himself when he announced it, as the Farewell Address Doctrine. In other words, meaning George Washington's Farewell Address Doctrine, where in there, Washington, when he was leaving the presidency, said that the United States must be forewarned to never become embroiled in the conflicts of the European powers. So he said, stay away from that, do not get involved. And that's what Monroe said, and became kind of the explicit phrase that was used for the next 100 years, or 80 years at least. Let's see. I think that's at least situates a little bit of what the Monroe Doctrine was. Let me mention a couple examples of how it was implemented. Let's see. So in 1863, for example, this was one of the key times it was evoked, even though it was not acted upon. Mexico's president Benito Juarez had announced a moratorium on Mexico's sovereign debt payments. So they had debts to creditors in Switzerland that were also held by probably various European aristocracy. Juarez said, we're not paying these, they're illegitimate, you're crushing us as a nation, and we're free. The British, the French, and the Germans, and maybe another country, but they all sent, not the Germans, Spain, the Spanish. They threatened Mexico, Juarez, that if he didn't repay, that they would invade and impose a new monarchy to force Mexico to pay its debts. So Juarez reached out to Lincoln invoked the Monroe Doctrine, said this is a clear case of the Monroe Doctrine. Please defend us from the European imperialists. Lincoln, of course, was embroiled in the Civil War in 1863. Not exactly the best time, so he was sympathetic, and he sent a very strong letter to the Europeans saying, do not invade, but he was not going to get the U.S. involved during the Civil War. So that unfortunately happened. They imposed, I forget his name, he was connected to the Habsburgs. And within 2 decades, this new European king, imposed Mexican king, who was imposed at the barrel of a gun, was not only overthrown but hung by a Mexican revolt, and that's how that ended. But that was the sense of what the South Americans, what Mexico had saw, in terms of what the Monroe Doctrine represented for them. Now, another case where we acted on it was in the Dominican Republic in 1861, where the where Spain landed in the Dominican Republic, declared it now part of this Kingdom of Spain, and the U.S. still in the Civil War, but a little bit more seriously, sent our representative and sent a letter to Spain and said that if you don't leave, then we're gonna intervene, we're gonna kick you out. And that was enough to get the Spanish to withdraw right at the end of the Civil War, and give Dominican Republic their freedom again. So anyways, just to give you a sense, this was not, and I should probably say it more explicitly, because people tend to reference the Monroe Doctrine as the beginning of America's imperial rule, and it was explicitly the opposite. It was announced at a time when European colonialism was very live, was a force in the world to prevent the emergence of a second United States. And that's, I think, the key thing, is that the British and others were so enraged that there was a successful American Revolution that they were doing everything they could to prevent another one. And that's the context in which the Monroe Doctrine came in. So now what happened, which I think is what people do know from today, is in early 1900s, 1904, Theodore Roosevelt shifted the whole discussion, and he imposed what he called his Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine into place. Essentially, this took place when, incidentally, around Venezuela, there was claims of debt repayment that were demanded by the Europeans. Venezuela refused, and so several European countries sent gunboats and started bombing, blockading Venezuela, and called on, obviously there was a situation that emerged of what is the U.S. going to do. And Roosevelt stood the Monroe Doctrine on its head. He said, the question is not sovereignty, equality, and non-interference, but it is justice and it's civility. So get that. I don't know who decides who is civil and who is not civil, but this is what Roosevelt said in announcing the updated Monroe Doctrine in 1904, in the middle of the Venezuela conflict. He said, any country whose people conduct themselves well can count upon our hearty friendship. If a nation shows it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order and pays its obligations, in other words, debts, it need fear no interference from the United States. So that's what he said. However, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence from this said country, it may ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and it may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to exercise of an international police power. So, a very different concept of Monroe and John Quincy Adams. This, in this particular case, Teddy Roosevelt didn't actually intervene, but he allowed the British, the French, and I believe it was the Germans to continue their intervention until Venezuela was forced to capitulate and reach some sort of compromise and pay the European debt holders, with the U.S. intentionally holding back and allowing the military action to proceed. So now, with that said, I think that's important to recognize. That's the Trump doctrine. It's not the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's the corollary to the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, which is the establishment of an imperial order where civility and whatever we feel like calling the rules that are acceptable to us, that's the law of the land, and sovereignty goes out the window. Now, one more thing before I say a few more things and conclude, which is that right at the same time, there was a fellow named Luis Drago, who was the foreign minister of Argentina, who disagreed. And he waged a response, or he waged a complaint to the whole situation in what became known as the Drago Doctrine. So here's what he said. He said a creditor or debt holder or whatever it would be is aware that his contract of a debt is with a sovereign entity. It is an inherent condition of sovereignty that executive procedures cannot be initiated or carried out against it. Meaning that if you establish a debt or a credit, a loan to an entity, a nation, then it's inherently included that it's a sovereign nation you're agreeing to loan a sum of money to. And if you violate that with violence, then you've negated the debt. It's almost Shakespearean in the way he posed it. So he said that so considering all the basis of what constitutes a legal agreement, one of the most precious is that which determines all states, regardless of the power at their disposal. And that is that they are all perfectly equal among themselves, and therefore in reciprocity deserving of the same consideration and respect. So he establishes no no creditor claim or debt obligation overrides the principle of sovereignty of a nation state. And then what does he do? He goes on to quote Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, who said that contracts between a nation and particular individuals are enforceable according to the conscience of the sovereign and cannot be the object of compulsory force. So anyways, you get the idea. He goes on to say that this isn't a defense of bad faith or disorder or deliberate insolvency, but it's simply an acknowledgement that there are rules that determine the cooperation and existence between nation states. So that's would be a very good lesson for Mr. Trump to learn, I think. Certainly, if you want to make America great again, you can't do it by not only destroying your relationship with other countries, other sovereign nation states that would be your allies, that should be your allies, but secondly, you can't do it by tearing up your own history. and destroying your former principles. In this case, the Monroe Doctrine's commitment to being an anti-imperial nation, and defending other weaker states against the imperial push from, from debt holders in this case. So that's the last thing you would do. In fact, what the LaRouche organization is doing is, as people may be familiar, is attempting to make the true history of the United States more known so that people can use it to draw upon in reviving what is the better and true aspects of our nation's history. So I think I should stop there. Could say there's probably a lot more we could talk about, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot for that, Stuart. That was really useful summary of the Monroe Doctrine and a presentation of the real history of the United States. I have several questions, actually. For people who want to ask questions that are listening in, please email questions@laroucheorganization.com, or if you're in the YouTube chat, you could simply post in the chat your question. But Stuart, let me ask you this. I just wanted to bring this up on screen real quickly because you were going through the history of Mexico in the mid to late 19th century and the role of the Europeans in intervening in Mexico and then trying to overthrow Mexican President Benito Juarez. I'm just going to put this on screen real quickly. This was a special report some people might be familiar with. This was Operation Juarez by Lyndon LaRouche, written in August 1982, and a paper which got him in a lot of trouble with Henry Kissinger at the time. And the idea, which you can see in the first paragraph in the foreword, throughout Ibero-America today, one hears often the wishful delusion: we must remain creditworthy. Ostensibly, unless this precious commodity called creditworthiness is protected with the utmost zeal, the angered international financial institutions will withhold new issues of credit from Ibero-American nations. Stuart, you may know more about the history of this paper, but from what I understand, there was a major debt crisis in Mexico at the time. Jose Lopez Portillo was president, who later became a very good friend of Lyndon LaRouche, and who LaRouche was organizing to call for a reorganization of the financial system, starting with the nations of Ibero-America, and which would have led to real credit being inserted into infrastructure projects, into the development of South America and so forth. But I just wanted to put that there because of what you were talking about with the history of Juarez. And of course, Abraham Lincoln played a very crucial role in providing support to Juarez to repulse Maximilian I and the Habsburg forces that were trying to overthrow the Mexican Republic. But I don't know if you have any comments about that paper.
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot to say about it, and I was actually, it's really fun to make fun of this creditworthiness thing because, that's the whole point of what this guy Drago gets at, is that you need to have a different basis. You need to have a different basis in law for what is actually your ability to understand the relations between nations. But I think the thing you brought up with Lopez Portillo is really interesting because it begs the question: well, what actually is the alternative policy? Because I would argue that while it's obvious from what I went through and I think what many people would agree, you don't want to allow debt holders to be the be able to intervene and overthrow a government when they feel like it. That's kind of the most it just turns international law on its head. However, just letting everything be some kind of like a rejection of all forms of imperialism, what does that mean? We're going to use our oil. Okay, what does that mean? What do you, what's actually the outcome of a policy that successfully imposes that kind of imperial overreach? And I think the reference of Portillo is really interesting, because what he did, and he was, like you said, he was really hated for it, was he said, we're going to use our natural resources to develop. We're not going to fall for the other British trap. By British trap, I mean British liberal free trade economics trap of perpetually selling our raw material resources so that we can prop ourselves up and live a decent life. He said, no, we're gonna use those to essentially trade for the technological development of our country. So he made a point to invest in all types of infrastructure, all types of modernization of farm equipment, modernization of new manufacturing capabilities. And like you said, LaRouche actually played a role. He was friends with Lopez Portillo. And I will point out, which I think is important to acknowledge, is that Venezuela has definitely a very mixed history with this. And the Venezuelan governments of the last 50 years have definitely not had the most successful economic strategy. Chavez, for example, allowed his oil exports as far as the budgetary, the revenues for the national government were well above 50%. I think I saw something at one point that the oil industry was over 96% of Venezuela's exports. So heavily weighted towards oil, similar to many of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others that tremendously, at least many years ago, had very heavily relied on these as a source of so-called money. But that's not really going to keep the so-called colonialists away from you for so long, because if you're dependent in just a different way, you're now dependent on your export markets to keep your whole nation and your whole economy afloat. So you need a very different idea around the industrialization of your nation. And so, yeah, I totally think I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. I think it's a very rich thing. People should read the Operation Juarez report. EIR has published a lot about Lopez Portillo and the fight he waged to not only nationalize Mexico's oil and raw materials reserves, but to reinvest and use the temporary sale of oil and other raw materials for trading for large-scale technological improvement that would, in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, would provide the basis for a modern industrial economy. And that's really what it means to exit this system of neo-colonialism today.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you think of when you were just talking about not just being resource dependent, but actually investing in technological advance, I was also caused to think about Henry Kissinger's National Security Study Memorandum 200, which stated very clearly that the United States was not going to allow the countries of South America, specifically the nations in the global South, to develop their own resources, and that the rise of population in these nations was a concern for national security. So I think that kind of shows the thread where this imperialist policy, starting with Teddy Roosevelt's perversion of the Monroe Doctrine, going into Kissinger and to what certain people in Trump's administration and what Trump himself is doing ultimately with regards to the Caribbean. I actually...
Yeah, just to say one thing on that, if I can. The other thing which happened, I mean, just the case of Venezuela is interesting because it, the exports of oil went through the roof. There was a lack of investment in real infrastructure and the manufacturing of the economy. So they were struggling, whatever you want to say. It's not really important to go into all the strengths and weaknesses, but what did the United States do? We sanctioned them. we put sanctions, which is, on top of the idea of trying to do economic pressure and to do a colonial policy. If you actually wanted to help solve the problem which you claim to be concerned about, sanctioning is going to do even worse. So that was the other side of the exact same coin of just destruction of a country's economy. So I just wanted to add that in.
Okay, just to bring in the audience here a little bit. Steve Kaler says, beginning in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt began using the U.S. military to collect debt payments from Latin America for U.S. banks. The Marines were maintained as a ready force, not the Army. Thanks for putting that in, Steve. And if people have other questions, please put them in the chat or email questions@laroucheorganization.com. And going to Theodore Roosevelt, I was having this discussion yesterday with Dennis Speed, actually, about thinking of the contradiction in the United States. And you could perfectly envision that with Mount Rushmore, because you got Washington, you have Lincoln, and then next to them you have Theodore Roosevelt and Thomas Jefferson, two people who really shouldn't be there, I think. And you also see this with the recent presidents in the U.S. presidency. Trump really loves Theodore Roosevelt. He's a great admirer of him. Not just him, Obama, Clinton, the two Bushes, and so forth, all appeal to him. And I think what you laid out as to what Roosevelt did to the Monroe Doctrine really lays out who he was and why it's important to know this history. I don't know if you have anything more to say about Roosevelt specifically, Theodore Roosevelt.
Well, I think it was said by someone at our International Peace Coalition yesterday that we have to get rid of this lie that you get peace through, you get security through, it wasn't through strength, but you don't get peace through security or through strength or through force. You get it through something different, because you don't change your your basis for actually having peaceful relations with a former enemy, with a former adversary, by by threatening him with the threat of more force and violence. You want to do something different, and I think that was really important to acknowledge that that's essentially the nut to crack as far as what the mixed history of the United States is. And this Teddy Roosevelt history is right there with speak softly and carry a big stick, which sounds kind of cool if you're in a Hollywood movie, but not really anything that you would want as a president of a country, let alone a country like the United States, which actually did represent something very different. The other thing too, which I think is worth mentioning, is that a lot of this is, a lot of what is coming out of the Trump administration's various mouths, is somewhat smoke and mirrors, and what they may claim about the somewhat bravado of the U.S. is back and we're going to dominate our Western Hemisphere again and treat it as our backyard, and we're going to make sure we keep all nations free of authoritarian regimes or whatever. Yeah, sort of is the case. I mean, it's definitely true, but also reading the national security strategy that the Trump administration put out a couple of weeks ago, it's clear that they have really been feeling the fact that China has changed the world, and recruited the majority of the global South over the last 5 or 10 years. This was not just a weak Biden, so to speak, or something like that, but that this has been akin to a global revolution, that the global South has shifted from its historic more generally, kind of a broad term, but from previous years when much of the world saw the United States as the paragon of virtue and of freedom and of prosperity. And that has now shifted increasingly to China. And that was a core tenet of the national security strategy. And that's very problematic because Trump talked about it, the security strategy talked about it from the standpoint of, that's why we have to kick China out of this, that, and the other thing, especially in the Western Hemisphere. But nonetheless, the reason I mention it is because you can get a sense that the power of history doesn't actually operate if whether you carry a big stick and whatever, whether you speak softly, loudly, carry a big stick or anything, it's not actually what the force of history it is, because what's happened is that real physical economic growth that China has exemplified and has significantly invested into countries across Africa, across Central and South America, major projects that have transformed countries' economies. That's something that's undeniable, and there is no amount of running coups and running sanctions that is going to convince people that that isn't what they actually want. So I just say that because anyways, no matter how much you're going to shout and scream and try to threaten, that's actually what is increasingly becoming the political situation. And the question is, will the U.S. respond to that?
Yeah, exactly. I think we saw an example of that with the recent youth conference that the Schiller Institute was hosting. This was December 14th. And the second panel of that, which I would point people to, had a very large representation from African nations, some people from the Middle East, from Yemen, and others in the global South, and a lot of them were largely focused on the economic development of their own countries. And I'll just play one of those presentations. There were many, but this was from Jasper Machugo. He's a young African youth in Uganda, I believe, and he heads up something called Fossil Fuels for Africa. And he makes a very strong point about the need for Africa to utilize its own resources for their own economic development. And we should all be aware that Africa, by 2050, by projections, will have 2.5 billion people, and most of those people will be young. So that's, of course, something we should be engaged in. But why don't I just play the presentation, and Stuart, I'd like to hear your response to it.
Hello everyone, my name is Jasper Machogu. I am a small-scale farmer located in rural Kisii, Kenya. Kisii is one of the counties out of the 47 other counties. And most importantly, I am the founder and chairman of Fossil Fuels for Africa, which is an organization that advocates for the use of Africa's own natural resources, that is coal, oil, and gas, for its own people, for the economic development. We have been operational for over 2 years, And in those 2 years, we have been doing the advocacy and, of course, walking the talk by connecting people to the national grid, providing people with clean water, clean cooking, etc., etc. So today, I'm reaching out to you guys so that I can explain to you why fossil fuels for Africa, because I know every other person has got the news that the world is going to be ending because of climate change, and that is the one big issue that we should be dealing with. I can tell you for sure, nobody in my community is alarmed about climate change, because we have far bigger problems. I literally know people who go to bed hungry from day to day. People have got water problems. They come to my place, fetch water, and a million other issues, especially where their next meal is going to come from. That is what people are worried about, not climate change, really. I can say for sure also that one of the easiest ways for us to improve most Africans' lives is by improving agriculture, because 6 to 7 out of 10 Africans rely on agriculture for livelihood. And if you go to the rural setting, you realize that it's over 90% who rely on agriculture for livelihood. So how do we improve agriculture? Of course, we need fertilizer. Number one is going to be fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer or nitrogenous fertilizer. We can't have nitrogenous fertilizer unless we have natural gas. And of course, Africa's got plenty of natural gas. Yeah. Only that most of the natural gas we have at the moment is going about 45% is going outside the continent. Number two, we need farm mechanization or farm machineries. Farm machinery is how we're going to change agriculture in a big way, because we have to stop relying on muscle to perform various farm work. Number three, we need farm irrigation and greenhouses. And of course, when it comes to farm machinery, farm machines cannot run on batteries. They cannot run on electricity. They have to run on diesel, because diesel has got some unique features. And of course, the farm machines, they're made from plastics and steel, the two which are made from fossil fuels. So number three was irrigation. Irrigation, the piping is going to be made from plastics, and then the pump is made from plastics and steel, more fossil fuels. And I had the opportunity to recently pass through Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania. I've been to Tanzania several times, and some other, I've traversed Kenya. And I can say for sure that we need irrigation. That is for sure. And number four is going to be value addition. Value addition is going to be a game changer. That is how we are going to have to create employment for our youths. And Africa by day is majorly, the median age is 19, 20. So our population is mostly young people, and we need jobs for these young people. We should stop exporting raw stuff, be it coffee, be it cocoa, be it gold, be it whatever, oil. And the funny thing is, like, Nigeria is one of the biggest oil producers in Africa and in the world, among the top oil producing countries. But then Nigeria has not been refining their own oil. They take it outside and the oil is refined, and then Nigeria buys it. Some things just don't make sense. And you hear that Belgium and these other countries are the biggest coffee industries, coffee marketers or producers. No, not producers, literally, it's manufacturers. Yeah, coffee manufacturers in the world. But then you realize that Europe does not grow any coffee. That coffee is coming from African countries. So we should stop exporting raw produce to these Western countries. And of course, that is me talking about agriculture. But then we also need fossil fuels because of the 4 pillars of modern civilization. The 4 pillars of modern civilization include steel, cement, plastics, and fertilizer, the ones I've talked about. But the one industry that is running every other industry is the energy industry. And that is very essential. We are literally Africa is getting over 90%, almost 90% of their energy from burning biomass. Biomass is me burning firewood. That is how Africa is powered, literally. And you go to these other countries, the ones preaching to us about climate change, and you realize that those countries are burning a ton of oil. They're burning a ton of coal. They're burning a ton of natural gas. But then they're telling Africans, they're preaching to Africans about saving the planet and decarbonizing and net zero and energy transition, fancy terms that are, I would say, neo-colonial terms. That is how I would term them as. So Africa needs fossil fuels for sure, and that is our only way out of poverty and hunger and these other issues. Of course, we have corruption and the other issues, but I can tell you for sure that number one is going to be fossil fuels for Africa. Don't worry about climate change. If you look at the data shows a different picture. It paints a different picture from what you hear from mainstream media and the UN. Don't worry about climate change. Africans are not worried about climate change. We are worried about bigger issues which can only be solved, or that can be certainly solved by using a ton of our own coal, oil, and natural gas. Thank you very much. I will thank you, Sheila Institute, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Fossil fuels for Africa. Yeah.
That was great.
Yes, very great. Yeah.
Any response?
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. I mean, the other thing too that someone else in the conference had said, which was similar, was that look, this was the youth conference. Another person from Africa, I forget who it was, but said, look, we don't really care about this GMO food stuff. I know you guys all like talk about non-GMO foods, but we just want food, so you just kind of see the separation, the divorce from reality of what really is going on in the minds of so much of the rest of the world. We might think that we're in a that we know what's best, but I think the healthiest response to comments like Jasper's there is, well, maybe we need to reconsider what our priorities actually should be, because if we don't have a orientation which is for the actual needs of the majority of the world, then we're really not providing leadership. There's really no leadership being provided. We are at a point of major civilizational shift right now. It's very clear. A lot of people, I think, have that sense, but you'll never reach it if you think from the bottom up about, well, how do I replace this politician in Washington, D.C., or how do I stop this organization? There's a lot of people that I've worked with and speak to about there's certainly very real dangers, for example, with stopping a lot of problems in the world. But if you don't have the perspective of what really is the needs of mankind and what really is the need, in this case, of probably between 3 and 5 billion people who still don't have access on a daily basis of electricity, of clean water, reliable electricity, fresh water, and other energy output, other basic things, then you're really not in the situation where we can actually provide a real coherent concept of what needs to be done. So I think it's extremely useful. I think that we can probably get a lot of insight actually from some of the emerging leadership from Africa in terms of where where avenues for the West rediscovering its better traditions, the United States rediscovering its better tradition, this can help us figure that out, I think. So I think it's great. I'm happy you showed it.
I completely agree with that. And, I always think to the Bandung conference and what the Indonesian president at the time, Sukarno, said about the American Revolution being the first anti-colonial revolution. And it's useful to reflect on what he said now and think about how other nations in the world are discovered what the American Revolution is about and are actually applying it better in their own countries than we are here. I mean, China is certainly doing that for sure. But let me do this. Since you referenced Dennis Small's presentation from yesterday, I think it would be useful for people to look at just a brief section of that, because because he goes through parts of the national security strategy and some of the major flaws in it. For example, saying that the Belt and Road Initiative is a threat and that we need to contain its influence in the Western Hemisphere. And Dennis goes on to propose what the U.S. could actually do in South America with other countries. So why don't we just play that real quickly?
Now, what's the attitude towards LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, this is really what has caused a huge commotion about the national security strategy document, and rightly so. It says, we want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. In other words, we will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Parenthetically, I would just offer the necessary corrective. That's really the Trump corollary to the Roosevelt corollary, because the Monroe Doctrine had a totally different approach. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. The document goes on to say, rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. Let me translate that. That means we're going to invade anywhere we damn well feel like it. Rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere, military installations, ports, and key infrastructure. In other words, they're talking about China and the Belt and Road and the BRICS countries and anyone outside of the United States that's in this global South grouping will not have the right or the ability to help this region develop. Here's what the China LAC policy paper says. China is ready to carry out trilateral development cooperation in LAC countries. Now, I really want to emphasize that. Trilateral development cooperation. What are they talking about? Well, not only the Latin American countries and China, they're talking and they are open to third countries, i.e. the United States. This is, again, the open Chinese offer to the United States and to Europe to join in this process of development. So they say that China's ready to carry out trilateral development cooperation in LAC countries with relevant countries outside the region and international organizations under the premise that such cooperation is proposed, agreed upon, and dominated by countries in the region. China welcomes more LAC countries to join high-quality Belt and Road cooperation so as to achieve modernization of peaceful development. And finally, the fourth point is really the most substantive, is the question of the economy. What is being offered to this region by these two completely diametrically opposed worldviews and views of what the global system should be? Here's what the national security document says. Expanding American access to critical minerals and materials while countering predatory economic practices. We want other nations to see us as their partner of first choice, and we will, through various means, discourage their collaboration with others. Perhaps a various mean is the presence of, in the Caribbean, of the USS Gerald Ford and the largest military force ever gathered in the Caribbean. It's about a quarter of US military capabilities altogether. So through various means, we will discourage their collaboration with others, utilizing US leverage in finance and technology to induce countries to reject such assistance from countries like China. We should make every effort to push out foreign companies that build infrastructure in the region. Here's what China says about the economy. Energy development and utilization across the whole industrial chain, increase cooperation in oil, gas, and other traditional energy sectors, and deepen cooperation on peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We will actively explore establishing mechanisms of long-term supply and local currency pricing, not free market. Long-term supply, state to state, long-term supply and local currency pricing and settlement of energy and resource products so as to reduce the impact of external economic and financial risks. And they continue. Planning and construction of infrastructure in LAC countries so as to enhance regional infrastructure connectivity and consistently empower regional economic growth and sustainable development. Science and technology innovation. Support will be given to young scientists from LAC countries to carry out short-term scientific research in China. And finally, make good use of space technology to boost LAC countries' scientific, technological, and industrial development. Active participation of LAC countries in China's manned space program. Development assistance to LAC countries without attaching any political conditions. Not exactly what they get from the IMF and the Wall Street today. And finally, information on poverty alleviation, as well as experience in targeted poverty alleviation. And everyone in Iberoamerica and throughout the world knows what China has done to alleviate poverty, pulling 850 million people out of poverty in 40 years. And people say, if China can do it, why not we? And just think of this, put yourself in the shoes of a young global South leader, or even an older one, who looks at this and says, well, what is our future going to be? What's our choice? It's somewhat of a no-brainer, right? But just to make sure, let's take a look at what the actual major development projects are that China has developed over the last 20 years approximately in Iberoamerica, either built them or proposed them that have then been sabotaged by Wall Street. These are just the major ones. This is not comprehensive. Everyone knows about the Chancay port in Peru. Built, done, there. The Bioceanic Railroad is under discussion between China and Brazil and also with Peru, not yet built. Mutun, right under that. This is one of the world's most gigantic iron ore deposits in Bolivia. And China helped Bolivia to develop the first steel plant in the entire history of the country. Bolivia has always exported, like any third world country, its primary resources, like iron ore, never had steel. Now they have steel. And then the Nicaraguan Canal, this is a project for a new sea level canal, greatly needed if world trade is to increase across Nicaragua. It's on hold. And then also proposals for high-speed rail lines, which the Chinese have made with concrete proposals. Panama was accepted. It was never built. The idea is to build the line straight through all of Central America. 2 or 3 such lines were proposed for Mexico, from Mexico City to Querétaro, and then across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, also sabotaged by Wall Street and the British. So, but this is the kind of stuff that they are offering for the Western Hemisphere. It's the kind of stuff that's being done in Asia and being done in Africa. But this is what is on the table. So finally, now let's compare this to what the United States has helped build by way of big infrastructure projects in the same region also over the last 20 years. So this is China, and this is the United States. No, it's not a mistake. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And so countries around the world, but especially in this region, look at this and say, well, it's kind of a no-brainer what kind of world we need. The crucial issue here is we have to have the kind of cooperative development with the United States, with Europe, that the Chinese themselves are proposing, this trilateral cooperation offer, because that kind of reorganization on a global scale is a total change in the parameters of the entire world system to a different kind of approach, different than a multipolar world. This is not multipolar, what we're talking about. Multipolar, as we've repeatedly said, incorporates the idea of geopolitics, and you can see where geopolitics leads you. So this was just a brief excursion into the actual primary sources rather than reading media accounts, so people can get a sense of what the actual issues are on the table.
All right, I think that's good. Before you respond to that, Stuart, there were a couple of comments in the chat. One of them were just simply asking what this Trump corollary to Theodore Roosevelt's corollary was, which I think you made clear already, that Teddy Roosevelt had defended debt collection in the South American countries. And you have Trump now claiming that that Venezuela essentially owes the United States since they're sitting on our land, our oil. Maybe it bears repeating, but anyways, your response to what we just heard.
Yeah, sure. What you just said is pretty much it. The Trump corollary was announced, the Roosevelt corollary was announced almost 100 years, 80 years after the Monroe Doctrine, but it was kind of supplanted the Monroe Doctrine, and unfortunately did become a precedent for much of the 20th century. So, and as you probably know, people have bad connotation of the idea of the Monroe Doctrine for that reason, for what Teddy Roosevelt did to it, and then the subsequent history of the U.S. So, no, the thing I would say to in response to Dennis is, I mean, it's very good what he did to lay that out, as far as the distinction between what the Chinese have done and what the United States has done. And if you look at the Trump national security strategy, it's remarkable. He doesn't, whoever wrote it doesn't even mention this. They acknowledge that China has come in. They call it predatory. They call it whatever. But there's no recognition that the U.S. has to revive its former policy of the same kind of thing. There's zero recognition except to say that the U.S. is going to reconsider what its strategy toward the global South might be. And that's it. So they have some work to do. They have some reading to do. The other thing I'll just mention, I was thinking about it, and it's a useful thing to bring up, I think, is that in the next week or two, Leonora magazine, which is published by the Schiller Institute, will be releasing its next issue, holiday issue or winter issue. And I think Executive Intelligence Review will be publishing one of the articles in that sometime next year, early next year as well. But there's an article that's going to appear on Nicholas Biddle, who is the chairman of the Second National Bank, which was 1830 until the late 1830s. And the interesting thing about Nicholas Biddle, so actually before I say that, he was the one that essentially executed the American policy of credit for massive infrastructure development. So massive internal improvements. There was fits and starts with the original bank under Alexander Hamilton. That was significantly attacked by many different, pro-Wall Street circles in the country. But then Biddle was the head of the Second National Bank. which was reinstated after about a 20-year hiatus, which was enormously successful and financed countless railroads, countless canals. Some of the most significant projects in those early years of the country were from Nicholas Biddle's Second National Bank. And Biddle was, interestingly, not a banker. He was a geographer. He was a historian. He founded a philosophical society. So he was a thinker. He was an intellectual, and that's who became a successful banker, because banking and economics is not about money and finance and a bunch of numbers and algorithms. Economics is about using the powers of the human mind to know how to leverage your investments to transform a nation and the nation's physical capabilities. And Nicholas Biddle did one of the best jobs of any banker, probably in the 19th century. So anyways, I just thought that's worth mentioning, because we're talking about a real policy of economics to flank and destroy imperialism. And really what you're talking about is not economics 101 or some kind of old stale whatever, textbook, but you're talking about the creative insights of anybody from Mississippi or from Africa that would have the insight about how to transform their nation. And that's actually what kind of optimism we want to bring to a future generation. I think right now that's the most impactful thing we can do is to unleash that kind of optimism in the world.
Yeah, let me just say, someone in the Rumble chat had said that they had just purchased a book about John Quincy Adams. I just want to say that's a very good thing, and I think we should do a lot more background research to really figure out who John Quincy Adams was. I mean, he's one of the most unrecognized presidents and leaders of the United States. And one thing people may want to do that are listening to this is do research specifically when he was a child and later a teenager, because he was born during the American Revolution. And when he was 11, he had actually gone with his father to Europe. He was in France, the Netherlands, other countries, and he had largely gone to school there as well. But also at the age of 14, he had served as the private secretary and the French interpreter for Francis Dana, the U.S. minister to Russia. He was in Russia as well. I should have mentioned that, which is very incredible. That's a real youth movement that John Quincy Adams was a part of. But anyways, that was, I think, Carrie who had put that in the chat. Thanks for putting that in. And so we're coming up on a conclusion now. Stuart, since you are responsible for the daily briefing of the Executive Intelligence Review, let me allow you to boost that, tell people why you should subscribe, and whatever other comments you have.
Sure. Yeah, definitely find us at eir.news and consider subscribing. You can get the free version emailed to you daily, or you can subscribe for $10 a month. It's worth it. We have a lot of insights which especially help keep the strategic situation, kind of the strategic overview in focus, which is super. It's just unique. So we're approaching it from the standpoint that we're at a point of historic shift, and I think that there's not enough of that. There's not enough people who are sympathetic to the major crimes going on in the world today. For example, the situation in Gaza, which is still ongoing. There's still a genocide that is ongoing. And you can look at it from the standpoint of how destructive and evil this is, or you can look at it from the situation of what has changed in the world and now what is opened up because the so-called global leading nations have condoned a genocide the last 2.5 or over 2 years. So we're trying to provide that standpoint. I think it's valuable. People should give it a read. I don't know. The only other thing that I can say is that I think people should just be committed, like Kynan said. People should dig into history, should dig into some deep ideas, should get a sense that they're not living in normal times, and we have been surrounded by a totally depressing situation, not just politically and economically, but culturally. There's some of the worst ideas out there in modern culture, in kind of pop culture. It's become, you talk to people and I was actually sitting on the plane last month. I was reading a book, and there was a young guy who was in college in a university, and he said, "Wow." He kept looking at me reading. He said, "Wow, you're reading a book? Do you read books often?" And he was amazed that there was somebody reading this thing called a book. He said he hasn't really read a book other than when he has to study for a test or something. It was very funny. So we talked, and we should not accept that as a norm. We should enjoy figuring new things out, and that's the pathway I think we're gonna defeat the cynicism of our enemies and actually do something really good in the future of the world.
Yeah, hopefully they don't start outlawing books.
I agree.
Well, anyways, thanks a lot, Stuart. I think this was a very good program. I want to thank everyone that tuned in, whether you're on YouTube, Rumble, or X. And I showed the EIR.news website while you were going through it, but I'll just emphasize once again that people should go to the schillerinstitute.com and print out and read and circulate Helga Zepp-LaRouche's recent statement. I'll just show it on screen once again. This is the withdraw from NATO. New national security strategy requires new security architecture. You can download the PDF here. So with that, we'll conclude for today. Thank you, Stuart, for being on, and we will see people next week, the 27th.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
Mm-hmm.